The Three Golden Hairs. In a kingdom where ancient prophecies still held power and the boundary between fate and free will remained mysteriously blurred, a child was born to the poorest family in the poorest village under the most unusual circumstances anyone could remember. The baby was a boy named Felix, born in a tiny cottage with a leaking roof and dirt floor, to parents who were so poor they could barely afford to feed themselves, let alone a new baby. His father was a woodcutter who earned mere pennies for back-breaking labor, and his mother took in washing from wealthier families, scrubbing clothes until her hands were permanently reddened and rough. They had nothing to offer this child except love, which they possessed in abundance, and hope for a better future, which seemed impossible given their desperate circumstances. But on the night of Felix's birth, something extraordinary happened that would change his destiny forever. 3 mysterious women appeared at the cottage door, though whether they were fairies, fates, or angels, no one could say with certainty. They were ageless and beautiful in a way that was both comforting and slightly terrifying, dressed in flowing robes that seemed woven from starlight and shadow, and they carried with them an aura of power and knowledge that made the very air shimmer around them. They asked to see the newborn child, and when Felix's exhausted mother brought the baby to them, wrapped in the only blanket she owned, the 3 women looked at him with eyes that seemed to see not just who he was but who he would become. "This child," the first woman said, her voice like distant bells echoing across mountains, "is born under a star of great fortune. He will rise from poverty to prosperity, from powerlessness to authority, and before his 25th year he will marry the princess of this kingdom and become heir to the throne. No force can prevent this destiny. It is written in the fabric of fate itself, woven into the pattern of his life as surely as threads are woven into cloth. Poverty will not hold him, obstacles will not stop him, and those who oppose his destiny will find themselves defeated by forces they cannot control or understand." The 3 women blessed the child, touched his forehead with fingers that left a faint golden glow on his skin that faded after a moment, and then they departed as mysteriously as they had arrived, leaving Felix's parents stunned and confused, hardly daring to believe what they had witnessed and heard. But word of the prophecy spread quickly through the village and eventually reached the ears of the king himself. A cruel, paranoid man named King Aldrich who ruled through fear and control, who tolerated no threats to his power, and who was determined that his daughter Princess Alara would marry someone of his choosing, someone who would strengthen his political alliances and increase his wealth, not some peasant boy born in a hovel. King Aldrich was enraged by the prophecy, seeing it as a direct challenge to his authority and control over his daughter's future. "I will not allow fate to dictate what happens in my kingdom," he declared to his advisors, his face red with fury and indignation. "I am the king, and I decide who marries my daughter, not some mystical prophecy spoken by mysterious women who appeared from nowhere. This peasant child will never marry Alara, never inherit my throne, never rise above the poverty he was born into. I will ensure it no matter what it takes." The king traveled in secret to the cottage where Felix lived, disguised as a wealthy traveler, and found Felix's parents in their usual state of desperate poverty, struggling to provide enough food for their growing son. The king pretended sympathy and concern, offering them a large bag of gold in exchange for their baby, claiming he was a childless merchant who longed for a son to raise and eventually inherit his business. "Your child will have opportunities you could never provide," the king said with false kindness, his voice smooth and persuasive. "He'll be educated, well-fed, trained in business, given a future far beyond what poverty can offer. You love him, don't you want what's best for him? This gold will transform your lives, and the boy will have everything you cannot give him." Felix's parents were torn between their love for their son and the desperate reality of their poverty. They knew they could barely feed him, could never afford education or opportunities, could offer nothing but love and hardship. The king's offer seemed like a miracle, a chance to give their son the better life they desperately wanted for him. With breaking hearts and tears streaming down their faces, they agreed to the king's proposal, kissing their baby goodbye and watching as the stranger carried him away, convinced they were doing what was best despite the anguish it caused them. But King Aldrich had no intention of raising Felix or giving him opportunities. As soon as he was away from the cottage, the king placed the baby in a wooden box, sealed it tightly, and threw it into a raging river, confident that the child would drown and the prophecy would be defeated by his own decisive action. "Fate may have plans," the king muttered as he watched the box disappear downstream, But I have power, and power always defeats prophecy. This peasant threat is eliminated, and my daughter's future remains under my control. However, the box didn't sink. It floated downstream, carried by currents and protected by forces the king didn't understand or believe in, until it reached a small village many miles away where a kind miller and his wife discovered it caught in the reeds near their water wheel. When they opened the box and found a baby inside, alive and healthy despite his ordeal, they were amazed and grateful, seeing the child as a gift from Providence. The miller and his wife had longed for children but had none of their own, and they immediately fell in love with baby Felix, adopting him as their son and raising him with love and care, never knowing his true origins or the prophecy that surrounded his birth. Felix grew up in the miller's household, loved and valued, learning the milling trade and developing into a young man of remarkable character and capability. He was kind to everyone regardless of their station, honest in all his dealings, hardworking without complaint, and possessed of natural intelligence and wisdom that impressed everyone who knew him. He had a gift for solving problems, for bringing people together, for seeing solutions where others saw only obstacles. The golden glow that had briefly appeared on his forehead when the three women blessed him had faded from sight, but some quality of grace and destiny remained visible in his bearing and his character, making people naturally trust and respect him even though he was just a miller's adopted son with no wealth or status. When Felix was 20 years old, tall and capable and admired throughout the region, fate intervened again in the form of a chance encounter. King Aldrich, now older but no less cruel or controlling, happened to be traveling through the area and stopped at the miller's house seeking refreshment and rest. The miller welcomed the king graciously, and Felix served the royal visitor with competent efficiency and natural dignity that caught the king's attention. As they talked, the king learned that Felix had been found as a baby in a box in the river 20 years earlier, and a cold dread began to form in Aldrich's chest. "Describe the box," the king demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and growing fear. When the miller described it exactly as the king remembered, the specific type of wood, the way it was sealed, the size and shape, Aldrich realized with horror that his attempt to murder the prophesied child had failed, that the boy he'd thrown into the river had survived and grown into this impressive young man, that fate had protected what he'd tried to destroy. But the king was nothing if not persistent in his cruelty and determination to control his daughter's future, so he decided to make another attempt to defeat the prophecy. "You've raised a fine young man," the king said to the miller, forcing his voice to sound pleased and approving. "In fact, I'm so impressed with him that I'd like to offer him a position at the palace. I need someone trustworthy to carry an important sealed letter to the queen. It contains sensitive information about palace business that must be delivered personally and confidentially. Would Felix be willing to make this journey? I'll pay him well for the service, and it will give him an opportunity to see the capital and perhaps find better opportunities than a small village can offer." Felix agreed to the task, honored to be trusted with royal business and excited about the opportunity to travel to the capital city. The king gave him a sealed letter addressed to the queen, along with money for the journey and detailed directions to the palace. But what Felix didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the letter contained not business information but murder instructions. "The bearer of this letter is a dangerous enemy of the crown. Execute him immediately upon arrival and dispose of his body. Tell no one. This is done by my authority and for the kingdom's protection. King Aldrich." Felix set out on his journey with the sealed letter safely tucked in his pack, traveling through forests and over hills, making good time despite the distance. But on the second night of his journey, as darkness fell and exhaustion overcame him, Felix stopped to rest in a clearing near the road, using his pack as a pillow and falling into deep sleep almost immediately. While he slept, a group of forest bandits discovered him and their leader, a rough, scarred man who nonetheless possessed a strange sense of honor and justice, found and opened the sealed letter, curious about what valuable information this young traveler might be carrying. When the bandit leader read the execution order, he was shocked and outraged. He had robbed many people over his years as an outlaw, had stolen and fought and lived outside the law, but he drew the line at murder, especially the murder of someone who was clearly innocent and unaware of the danger he was carrying. "This boy doesn't even know he's carrying his own death warrant," the bandit said to his companions. "The king is using him as an unknowing messenger to his own execution. That's not justice," That's cowardly murder disguised as royal authority. I won't let it happen. The bandit leader carefully opened the king's letter, breaking the seal with practiced skill, and rewrote the message completely, using his considerable talent for forgery, a skill he'd developed during his criminal career, to perfectly match the king's handwriting and seal. The new letter read, "The bearer of this letter, Felix, is a young man of exceptional character and capability whom I have chosen to marry my daughter Princess Alara. Arrange the wedding immediately upon his arrival. This is my command and my wish. He is to be treated as my future son-in-law and heir. King Aldrich." The bandit resealed the letter so perfectly that no one could tell it had been tampered with, placed it back in Felix's pack, and left the young man sleeping peacefully in the clearing, completely unaware that his life had just been saved by an outlaw's unexpected compassion and sense of justice. When Felix woke in the morning and continued his journey, he had no idea that the letter he carried had been completely changed from a death warrant to a marriage contract, from an order for execution to an invitation to royalty. Felix arrived at the palace and presented the sealed letter to the queen, who opened it, read the unexpected instructions and was utterly confused. She knew her husband had never mentioned choosing anyone to marry their daughter, knew that Aldrich was obsessively controlling about Alara's future, knew this made no sense. But the letter was undeniably in the king's handwriting, bore his official seal, and contained his explicit command. The queen, who secretly disliked her cruel husband and had always felt sorry for their daughter who would have to marry whoever Aldrich chose for political advantage rather than love, decided to follow the letter's instructions exactly. Princess Alara herself was brought to meet Felix, expecting to be presented with yet another pompous noble or wealthy merchant's son whom her father had selected for political or financial reasons. But instead she met a kind, honest, humble young man who treated her with genuine respect and interest rather than seeing her as a prize to be won or a political tool to be acquired. Felix was amazed to learn he was supposedly there to marry the princess. He thought he was just delivering a business letter. But he was also immediately captivated by Alara's intelligence, kindness, and the sadness in her eyes that suggested a life constrained by her father's control and cruelty. Alara, for her part, felt something she'd never expected to feel in an arranged marriage: genuine attraction and connection. Felix spoke to her as an equal, asked her opinions and thoughts, listened when she talked about her interests and dreams, and showed her a kind of respect and authentic interest that none of her previous suitors had demonstrated. Within days of meeting they had fallen genuinely in love, not because of the letter's instructions, not because of political necessity, but because they genuinely valued and enjoyed each other, because they shared similar values and dreams, because something real and authentic had sparked between them that had nothing to do with prophecies or royal commands. The wedding was arranged quickly as the letter had instructed, and Felix and Alara were married in a beautiful ceremony before King Aldrich even knew what was happening. When the king finally returned to the palace several weeks later and learned that his daughter had married the miller's adopted son, the very boy he'd twice tried to kill, he was beside himself with rage and disbelief. "How did this happen?" he roared at the queen and his advisors. "I sent that boy carrying his own execution order. How is he not only alive but married to my daughter?" But there was nothing the king could do. The marriage was legal and binding, performed according to his own written instructions, or so everyone believed, and witnessed by the entire court. Felix was now the prince consort, married to the princess, and heir to the throne by law and tradition. The prophecy spoken at his birth was coming true despite all of King Aldrich's attempts to prevent it, and the king was forced to accept a reality he'd spent 20 years trying to destroy. However, Aldrich was not ready to surrender completely. He pulled Felix aside for a private conversation, his voice icy with barely controlled fury and desperate determination to maintain some measure of control. "You may have married my daughter through trickery or fate or whatever mysterious force is protecting you," the king hissed, "but you will never truly be my heir, never truly be accepted by the nobility, never truly be respected as future king unless you prove yourself worthy of the position. And I have a task that will accomplish that proof. A task so difficult that you'll surely fail, and when you do, I'll have grounds to annul this marriage and remove you from succession." The king explained the task. In a distant realm beyond dangerous mountains and through perilous forests, there lived a fearsome demon who possessed 3 golden hairs that granted wisdom and power to whoever possessed them. Kings and heroes had tried for centuries to obtain these hairs, and all had failed, either dying in the attempt or returning empty-handed and broken. "Bring me 3 golden hairs from this demon," King Aldrich commanded, his smile cruel and confident, "and I'll accept you as my son-in-law and heir. Fail, and the marriage will be annulled on grounds that you're unworthy of royal position. You have 1 year. I suggest you start your journey immediately, as the task is impossible and the time is short." Felix had no choice but to accept this challenge, knowing that refusing would give the king grounds to annul the marriage anyway. He said goodbye to Alara, who wept and begged him not to go, knowing the task was impossible and fearing she would never see him again. But Felix promised to return, kissed his new wife tenderly, and set out on what seemed like a suicide mission, protected only by his courage, his character, and whatever mysterious force had preserved him from the king's previous murder attempts. The journey was long and perilous, taking Felix through territories he'd never imagined existed. He traveled through 3 kingdoms, and in each one he encountered people suffering from problems that seemed unsolvable, and in each case he promised to ask the demon for solutions if he managed to reach him and survive the encounter. In the first kingdom, a beautiful fountain that had once provided healing water had stopped flowing, and no one knew why or how to fix it. In the second kingdom, a great tree that had once produced golden apples had stopped bearing fruit, devastating the kingdom's economy and bringing poverty to what had been a prosperous land. In the third kingdom, a ferryman was cursed to operate his ferry endlessly without rest or relief, and he desperately wanted to know how to escape his eternal servitude. Felix finally reached the demon's realm after months of difficult travel, and he discovered that the demon was actually an ancient being, neither entirely good nor entirely evil, but powerful and knowledgeable beyond human understanding, living in a palace of black stone that radiated both danger and wisdom. The demon himself was enormous and terrifying, with skin like volcanic rock, eyes that burned like coals, and yes, golden hairs that grew from his head like threads of pure sunlight, each one containing centuries of accumulated knowledge and power. But Felix approached the demon not with weapons or attempts at theft but with honesty and respect, explaining his situation, the king's challenge, and the problems he'd encountered during his journey. "I need 3 of your golden hairs," Felix said simply, his voice steady despite his fear. "Not because I want power for myself, but because a cruel king has made it a condition of accepting my marriage to his daughter, whom I genuinely love. And while I'm here, I've been asked to seek your wisdom about 3 problems affecting 3 kingdoms. A healing fountain that stopped flowing, a golden apple tree that stopped bearing fruit, and a ferryman who wants to escape his eternal curse. I have no right to ask for your help, and I understand if you refuse, but I'm asking anyway because I have nothing to lose and everything to gain." The demon studied Felix with his burning eyes, and then he did something completely unexpected. He laughed, a sound like boulders rolling down mountains, and said, "You are the first person in 300 years to approach me with honesty and respect instead of trickery or violence. For that alone I'll help you. But I won't simply give you what you need. You must earn it through service and understanding. Stay here for 3 days, serve me faithfully, and ask your questions at the right moments, and you will leave with what you came for." Felix agreed, and he spent 3 days in the demon's service, cooking his meals, maintaining his palace, and listening to the ancient beings' stories about the long history of the world and the patterns that repeat across generations. On the first evening, as Felix was washing the demon's golden hair, he carefully plucked one hair, asking, "O wise demon, why has the healing fountain in the first kingdom stopped flowing?" The demon, relaxed and appreciative of Felix's careful service, answered, "Because a large toad sits beneath the fountain, blocking the sacred spring. Remove the toad, and the healing water will flow again." On the second evening, Felix plucked a second golden hair and asked, "Why has the golden apple tree in the second kingdom stopped bearing fruit?" The demon replied, "Because a serpent gnaws at the tree's roots, slowly killing it. Kill the serpent, and the tree will bloom and produce fruit again within 1 season." On the third evening, Felix plucked the third and final golden hair and asked, "How can the cursed ferryman escape his eternal servitude?" The demon smiled and said, "The curse will transfer to the next person he hands his oar to. He need only convince someone else to take the oar from his hand, and he will be free while they become the new ferryman. But warn him, he must ensure that whoever takes the oar understands what they're accepting, or the curse will double back on him with even worse consequences. Trickery only multiplies curses. Honest transfer releases them." Felix thanked the demon profusely for his wisdom and generosity, and the demon gave him one final gift. A small pouch containing magical seeds that would grow into whatever the planter most needed. A reward for being the first person in centuries to show him genuine respect rather than treating him as merely a source of power to be exploited. Felix left the demon's realm with the 3 golden hairs safely tucked in his pack, the answers to the 3 kingdoms' problems clearly remembered, and a sense that he'd gained far more than just the items the king had demanded. On his return journey, Felix stopped in each kingdom and shared the demon's wisdom. He helped the first kingdom remove the toad from beneath their fountain, and the healing water immediately began flowing again, stronger and purer than ever. He helped the second kingdom find and kill the serpent gnawing at the golden apple tree's roots, and within weeks the tree was blooming with promise of abundant fruit to come. And he warned the ferryman how to escape his curse, but also cautioned him about the importance of honest transfer rather than trickery. Each kingdom, grateful for Felix's help and the solutions he'd brought them, rewarded him generously with gold, jewels, and precious items, so that by the time he returned to King Aldric's palace, Felix was not just carrying the 3 golden hairs but was also accompanied by a caravan loaded with wealth that rivaled the king's own treasury. He had succeeded not just in the impossible task but had done so with such grace and wisdom that his reputation had spread across multiple kingdoms, and people spoke of him as someone special, someone marked by destiny, someone who brought solutions and healing wherever he traveled. King Aldric was forced to acknowledge that Felix had succeeded in the impossible task, had obtained the 3 golden hairs that no one else had ever managed to acquire. But more than that, the king had to recognize that Felix had demonstrated exactly the qualities that make a good king: wisdom, compassion, fairness, courage, the ability to solve problems and help people, and the kind of character that earns genuine respect rather than demanding it through fear and control. The nobility and common people alike had heard stories of Felix's journey and his accomplishments, and they were already treating him as the rightful heir, as someone worthy of inheriting the throne. "You have succeeded where I hoped you would fail," King Aldric said bitterly during a private audience, holding the 3 golden hairs that represented his complete defeat. "You have proven yourself worthy in ways I cannot deny, have accomplished what seemed impossible, have demonstrated qualities I lack and have never valued. The prophecy spoken at your birth is coming true despite everything I did to prevent it, and I am forced to accept that some things, fate, destiny, providence, whatever you want to call it, are beyond even a king's power to control." But Felix, who had learned wisdom during his journey and his time with the demon, responded with unexpected grace and compassion. "Your Majesty, I don't want to be your enemy or your punishment. I love your daughter genuinely, and I want to be a good husband to her and a good ruler when the time comes. I understand that my rise from poverty to royalty threatens your sense of control and challenges everything you believed about power and authority. But perhaps the prophecy isn't just about me. Perhaps it's also about teaching all of us that true worthiness comes from character rather than birth, from service rather than domination, from wisdom rather than control. I'm not here to defeat you but to help create a better future for the kingdom we'll both serve." King Aldric had no response to such grace and wisdom, and though he never truly warmed to Felix or fully accepted him, he stopped actively opposing the marriage and the succession. When Aldric died several years later, Felix and Alara inherited the throne, and they ruled with the kind of wisdom, compassion, and justice that transformed the kingdom from a place of fear and control into a place of prosperity and genuine happiness. Felix never forgot his humble origins or the journey that had brought him from a cottage with a leaking roof to a palace with a crown. He planted the demon's magical seeds throughout the kingdom, and they grew into trees that produced whatever people most needed: food for the hungry, medicine for the sick, shelter for the homeless, becoming a living symbol of leadership dedicated to service rather than control. He remained in contact with the demon, visiting occasionally to learn more wisdom and to maintain the friendship they'd developed based on mutual respect rather than fear or exploitation. And the 3 golden hairs, those symbols of impossible achievement and wisdom gained through courage and character, Felix kept in a special place of honor, not as trophies of his accomplishment but as reminders of important truths. That prophecies often fulfill themselves not through magic but through the character they inspire in those who hear them. That the greatest opposition often comes from those who fear losing control. That true worthiness is demonstrated through service and wisdom, rather than birth and privilege. And that sometimes the most fearsome guardians protect the most valuable wisdom, and approaching them with respect rather than violence or trickery opens doors that force and cunning cannot. Years later, when Felix was an old man telling stories to his grandchildren, they would ask about the 3 golden hairs and the impossible quest that had proven his worthiness. And Felix would smile and say, "The real treasure wasn't the hairs themselves, it was what I learned while seeking them. I learned that impossible tasks become possible when approached with honesty and respect instead of violence and trickery. I learned that helping others along your journey is more important than reaching your destination quickly. I learned that true demons are often those who try to control others through fear and cruelty, while creatures called demons might actually possess wisdom and fairness. And most importantly, I learned that prophecies aren't about fate forcing us down a predetermined path. They're about the character we develop in response to the challenges we face, the choices we make when those choices are difficult, and the kind of people we become when we have the courage to be our best selves despite obstacles and opposition." And in the kingdom that had once been ruled by fear and control, people remembered Felix's story as a reminder that true worthiness comes from within, that character matters more than birth, that wisdom and compassion create better leadership than power and cruelty, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not by those who seek them for selfish gain but by those who pursue them for love, for service, and for the good of others. The 3 golden hairs remained in the palace treasury, glowing softly in their honored place, eternal symbols of a truth that every generation must learn anew, that the impossible becomes possible when pursued with courage, character, and genuine care for others, and that the greatest magic in any kingdom is the magic of good people choosing to be their best selves despite every obstacle and opposition.